I almost left the family dinner before my mother finished her sentence. She looked across the table at me and said, "You know what your biggest problem is? You've become the family's biggest disappointment." Nobody moved. My younger brother, Daniel, lowered his eyes toward his plate. My father took a sip of water like he suddenly became very interested in the glass. I didn't argue. I just asked, "Is that what you really think?" My mother folded her arms. "I think everyone here knows it." That was the strange thing about my family. Everyone always knew what I was doing wrong. Nobody ever seemed interested in what I was doing right. I was 37 at the time, married, financially stable, and working for myself. I owned a small commercial property management company that I had built slowly over 12 years. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't drive an expensive car, and I rarely talked about money. Daniel was 34 and worked in sales. He was confident, outgoing, and very good at making people believe he was successful even when things weren't going particularly well. My parents adored him. They had always adored him. When we were kids, Daniel was the charming one. I was the responsible one. That distinction followed us into adulthood. If Daniel changed jobs, my mother called it taking a risk. If I changed jobs, she asked whether I was having another quarter-life crisis. If Daniel bought a new car, Dad wanted to see it. If I paid off a debt, nobody mentioned it. When Daniel announced that he was starting his own business, my parents hosted a dinner to celebrate. When I bought my first commercial building, I didn't tell them for almost a year. Not because I was hiding it. I just knew how the conversation would go. My mother would say, "That's nice." Then she'd ask whether Daniel had heard about some opportunity. I had learned a long time ago that attention was something I couldn't earn from them. So I stopped trying. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. It just meant I became better at carrying it. The dinner where my mother called me a disappointment was supposed to be about my grandmother. She had passed away 6 weeks earlier. She had been 91, lived independently until almost the end, and was the one person in our family who never compared me to Daniel. She never asked how much I made. She asked if I was sleeping enough. She never asked what kind of car I drove. She asked whether I was happy. And whenever I visited her, she had a way of making me feel like I had somehow done something worth being proud of. The family dinner was supposed to be a simple gathering before the estate paperwork was finalized. My grandmother had left behind a house, some investments, personal belongings, and whatever money remained in her accounts. None of us knew the exact details. My mother had repeatedly told everyone that there probably wasn't much. She lived modestly, she said. My father agreed. Daniel joked that he hoped Grandma hadn't left him her old furniture. I laughed because it seemed harmless. Then my mother started talking about the future. She said she wanted to make sure the family stayed close. I thought that was ironic, considering how often she had reminded me that I wasn't really part of the successful side of the family. She looked at Daniel. "You've always understood what family means." Then she looked at me. "You've always been distant." I put my fork down. "I live 3 hours away. That isn't what I mean." "I know." She sighed. "You've always acted like you don't need anybody." My father finally spoke. "Your mother is just saying that you've pushed everyone away." I looked around the table. "I didn't push anyone away." Daniel gave a small laugh. "Come on, man. You know how you are." "How am I?" He shrugged. "Cold." That word bothered me more than disappointment, because I had spent years trying not to become bitter. I had helped my parents financially when my father had surgery. I had paid for repairs to their roof without telling them it was me. I had driven through the night when my mother needed help after a fall. I had never thrown any of that in their faces. Apparently none of it counted. My mother shook her head. "You're so focused on your little business and your little life that you've forgotten where you came from." I almost smiled. My little business had 12 employees. But I didn't correct her. There was no point. Then she said the sentence that changed the evening. "You're the biggest disappointment in this family." Daniel stopped smiling. My father stared at his plate. And for the first time in my life, I realized something. They weren't waiting for me to defend myself. They expected me to accept it. So I did something different. I nodded. "Okay." My mother looked surprised. "Okay." "Yes." I stood up. "I'm going home." She stared at me. "You're just leaving?" "I think we've said enough." My father called after me as I walked toward the door. "We're still family." I turned around. "I know." Then I left. I drove home that night without calling anyone. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. The next morning, I received an email from an attorney I had never met. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She represented my grandmother's estate. The message was short. She asked me to attend a meeting at her office the following Friday. I assumed it was about paperwork. I almost ignored it. Then I remembered something my grandmother had told me 2 years earlier. We were sitting in her kitchen, drinking coffee. She had looked at me and said, "You know, being underestimated can be a very useful thing." I laughed. I don't think that's supposed to make me feel better. It should. Why? Because people reveal themselves when they think you have nothing to offer them. At the time, I thought she was talking about business. I didn't realize she was talking about my family. Friday came. I sat in Margaret's office across from her desk. She was in her 60s, calm and professional. She opened a folder. "Your grandmother made several changes to her estate plan over the last few years." I nodded. Okay. She wanted to make sure everything was handled privately until the appropriate time. I looked at her. "Is there a problem?" "No." She paused. "Actually, I think there may be some information you should know." She pulled out a document. "Your grandmother owned more than the family knew." I stared at the paper. It wasn't just her house. She had owned 2 commercial properties. One was in the same city where I had started my business. The other was across the state. There were investment accounts too. I felt confused. Why didn't anyone know? Margaret gave me a small smile. "Because your grandmother didn't want them to know." She turned another page. Then she said something that made me sit back. She also owned a controlling interest in a private holding company. I didn't understand. What does that have to do with me? Margaret looked directly at me. Everything. She explained that years earlier, my grandmother had quietly invested in several small businesses. One of those businesses eventually became the property management company I had built. I stared at her. That doesn't make sense. It does. She showed me the original documents. My grandmother had invested in the company when it was barely more than an idea. But there was something else. She had never taken control. She had structured the investment so that I retained operational control as long as the company remained independently managed. I had thought I had built everything alone. I had, but I hadn't been alone. My grandmother had been quietly protecting the opportunity. Margaret continued, "Your grandmother never wanted you to know while she was alive because she believed knowing could change the way you worked." I leaned back. That sounds like her. She also knew your parents would interpret the investment differently. I didn't have to ask what she meant. Margaret opened another document. There was a letter. My grandmother's handwriting filled the page. I read it slowly. She wrote that she had watched me build my life without asking anyone for approval. She wrote that she was proud of me. Then came the part one wasn't prepared for. She said she had intentionally left most of her personal estate outside the immediate family discussion because she knew there would be arguments. She had created a trust. The trust would provide my parents with a reasonable monthly allowance for the rest of their lives. Daniel would receive a separate amount. But the largest portion of the estate was going into a foundation. And I had been appointed trustee. Not because I was the most successful. Not because I was the richest. Because she believed I was the least likely to use money to control people. I read that sentence 3 times. Margaret watched quietly. "There is one more thing," she said. "What?" "Your mother requested an early meeting with me." My stomach tightened. "When?" 2 days ago. I said nothing. Margaret continued. "She wanted to know whether your grandmother had changed the estate plan." I looked at her. "What did you tell her?" "That I couldn't discuss confidential estate matters." Margaret closed the folder. She wasn't pleased. I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like my mother. Then Margaret said, "There is another reason I asked you to come." She slid a second document across the desk. It was a copy of an agreement connected to one of the commercial properties. I recognized the address immediately. It was the building where my company had rented its first office. I had spent years thinking my lease was simply a normal commercial lease. It wasn't. My grandmother had purchased the building quietly years earlier. She had arranged for my company to rent it at below market rates. The lease contained an option allowing my company to purchase the building under specific conditions. Those conditions had now been met. I looked at Margaret. "So the building can be purchased by your company under the terms your grandmother established." I sat there for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Because suddenly I understood how much she had seen that I hadn't. She had seen me struggling. She had seen me working late. She had seen me turn down opportunities because I couldn't afford them. And instead of giving me money, she had quietly created room for me to succeed on my own. She had never wanted me to owe her. She wanted me to believe I could do it. I left Margaret's office carrying copies of the documents. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Daniel. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then the family received notice about the formal estate meeting. Everyone attended. My mother arrived with Daniel. My father sat beside her. I sat across the room. Margaret began explaining the estate. My mother interrupted several times. Are you sure that's correct? Margaret remained professional. Yes. When she explained the trust arrangements, my mother looked confused. When she explained Daniel's inheritance, he seemed relieved. Then Margaret announced the foundation. My mother frowned. And who is the trustee? Margaret looked at me. Your son. My mother went completely still. Daniel looked at me. What? Margaret repeated it. My mother shook her head. No, that can't be right. It is. She looked at me. Then she laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because she couldn't process it. You? I didn't answer. She looked at Margaret. Why would my mother choose him? Margaret took a breath. Because your mother trusted his judgment. My mother stared at me. But he's the one who doesn't even care about this family. Nobody spoke. Margaret reached for the letter. I believe your mother explained why. She read the relevant portion. My grandmother had written, I trust him because he never needed money to prove he mattered. My mother looked down. Daniel shifted in his chair. My father rubbed his forehead. And suddenly the insult from that dinner came back to me. The family's biggest disappointment. Except now I understood what my grandmother had understood all along. My parents had measured success by who looked successful. My grandmother had measured it by who could be trusted when nobody was watching. The meeting ended quietly. Outside the office, Daniel caught up with me. Did you know about all this? No. He looked frustrated. You really didn't? No. He nodded slowly. Then he said, I thought Grandma was disappointed in me. I looked at him. She never told me that. She barely talked to me near the end. I considered that. You should have visited her more. He looked away. I know. That was the first honest thing I had ever heard him say about our family. Then my mother came outside. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse me. She just stood there. I owe you an apology, she said. I wasn't prepared for it. She looked older than she had a month earlier. I shouldn't have called you a disappointment. I nodded. No, you shouldn't have. She swallowed. I was wrong about you. I could have said 100 things. I could have reminded her about every time she compared us. Every time she celebrated Daniel and ignored me. Every time she made me feel like whatever I accomplished wasn't enough. But I didn't. Because I finally understood something. An apology doesn't require you to reopen every wound. Sometimes you can accept it without pretending nothing happened. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. She looked at me. Can we fix things? I thought about it. Maybe. She nodded. That's fair. And for once, she didn't argue. The foundation my grandmother created eventually became one of the most meaningful parts of my life. It funded scholarships for adults returning to school, small business grants, and emergency assistance for families who were struggling financially. I kept my company. I bought the building. But I never treated those things as proof that my mother had been wrong. That would have defeated the whole lesson my grandmother had left me. A year later, I visited my mother. We sat in her kitchen. She asked about work. I told her things were going well. She asked about Daniel. I said we were speaking more. Then she looked at me. You know what your grandmother taught me? I waited. She knew you better than I did. I smiled slightly. She knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. My mother nodded. Then she said something I never expected to hear. I used to think being successful meant making sure your children looked successful. She looked down at her coffee. Now I think maybe it's making sure they become decent people. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, that's a better definition. She smiled. There was still damage between us. I knew that. One conversation couldn't erase 30 years. But something had changed. For the first time, my mother wasn't asking me to prove anything. And I wasn't waiting for her approval anymore. Months later, I found my grandmother's original letter again while going through the estate files. There was one sentence I hadn't noticed before. It said, "Never mistake being overlooked for being unworthy." I sat at my desk for a long time after reading it. My mother had called me the family's biggest disappointment. My grandmother had quietly built an entire future around the person I had become when nobody was applauding. And in the end, the inheritance wasn't really the money, the buildings, or the business. It was the realization that I didn't need to become impressive enough to deserve love. I just needed to remain the person I was proud to be when nobody was looking. That was the part my family had never understood. And honestly, I don't need them to anymore.